The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Ashley Cooper pushed through the ICU doors at 0600 hours, moving with deliberate civilian slowness despite the trembling in her hands. 5 days without this. 5 days at the apartment staring at the unit patch she kept locked in a showbox under the bed. 5 days pretending to be the kind of person who had a normal sleep schedule. She clocked in at the nurse's station, careful to keep her shoulders rounded, her gaze cast down like she was still learning where the medication dispensers lived. This persona, quiet, cautious, almost apologetic in the way she occupied space, had taken 2 years to build. It was muscle memory of a different kind. The ICU at Sacred Heart in Savannah carried the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, mixed with something underneath that hospitals couldn't scrub away no matter how hard they tried. Decay. Endings. Hope circling the drain. She moved between the 4 occupied beds with the methodical precision of someone counting her heartbeats, checking vitals, noting the subtle shifts in monitor readings that most floor nurses missed. The tremor in her hands was genuine, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself back. Like a vault door with 3 locks keeping something dangerous from walking out. Bed 3 held the Army Ranger captain. He'd arrived 3 days ago, medevaced from Helmand Province with catastrophic internal bleeding that shouldn't have survived the flight, much less the first surgical consult. 34 years old. 2 deployments. Married with a daughter, according to the chart. Now he lay on high-flow oxygen with 2 units of packed red blood cells running simultaneously into 4s that had taken the surgical team for tries to place correctly. His abdomen was wrapped tight, surgical dressings already seeping at the edges despite being changed every 6 hours. The medical team had stabilized him, mostly through luck. Ashley had been watching the blood work, and luck was the only explanation that made sense. She reached for his monitors, her fingers moving with a kind of fluid precision that spoke of 17 years doing this somewhere that actual combat medics learned their trade. Not from a nursing textbook. The captain's sister sat vigil in the plastic visitor's chair. Her name was Rebecca. She was 31 and a school teacher who had flown in from Fort Campbell the day her brother coded in transport. Ashley had seen the desperate prayer behind her eyes every shift. She'd seen that look before. In hospital chaplains. In mothers. In soldiers who'd watched their brothers bleed out in red dust and never got the chance to say goodbye. "How's his oxygen saturation right now?" Ashley asked Rebecca quietly, her voice pitched soft, almost apologetic. She was adjusting the nasal cannula slightly, watching the monitor climb from 91% to 94% with the kind of attention that made the attending physician yesterday visibly uncomfortable. Rebecca looked up, blinking away tears that had probably been there since 0400 hours. Is he okay?" "Stable," Ashley said. The word was clinical, professional. The kind of word they taught you in nursing school to maintain appropriate boundaries. But her hands remained steady as she recorded the vitals, and her jaw didn't clench when she saw the lab results from 2 hours ago showing his hemoglobin still dropping despite the transfusions. Pain was information. Even when the patient was comatose. Even when the information was telling her that the medical team was watching him die and waiting for permission to stop trying. The fluorescent lights buzzed like they were alive. Angry. She'd counted once, during a 3rd shift rotation 2 weeks back, and found that they flickered roughly every 90 seconds. Tiny deaths. Tiny resurrections. The rhythm would drive some people crazy. It grounded her. Everything in the world moved in patterns if you paid attention long enough. Ashley finished her chart notes and stepped back toward the monitoring station where 3 other nurses were reviewing morning orders. She kept her posture slightly hunched, the way new nurses stood, the way she'd learned to stand when she'd decided that being invisible was the only way to keep everyone safe from whatever she carried inside. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, but she kept her old unit patch sewn inside the pocket of her jacket, hidden in the locker downstairs. A ghost from operations that officially never happened. From a rank she wore like a scar tissue. The doors to the ICU burst open with the kind of force that made 3 nurses look up simultaneously. Dr. Sterling entered first, his white coat immaculate, his expression carrying the particular arrogance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Behind him came four other physicians, a small entourage that made the ICU feel suddenly smaller, like the oxygen had been redistributed. Sterling moved directly to bed 3 without checking charts, without consulting the nurses who'd been maintaining the captain's vitals for 72 hours. His presence made the air pressure change. "This is the medevac case," Sterling said to the assembled physicians, not as a question but as a statement of fact. His voice was pitched to carry authority without seeming to try. Catastrophic blunt trauma. Internal bleeding. Multiple organ involvement. The surgical team performed exploratory laparotomy and achieved temporary hemorrhage control, but he paused, glancing at the captain's sister with something that wasn't quite contempt but wasn't far from it. "The injuries are incompatible with functional recovery." Ashley's hand stopped moving. She was reaching for the medication cart, but her fingers had gone very still, the way they went still right before she used to pull a trigger. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at Sterling. She continued her movement to the medication cart with the same mechanical precision, but her hearing had sharpened to the point where she could distinguish each physician's breathing pattern. One was nervous. 2 were deferential to Sterling. 1 was quiet in a way that suggested he was calculating odds and distances in his head. "We're recommending comfort measures only," Sterling continued. "The family should understand that continued aggressive intervention is prolonging inevitable death rather than promoting life. I'll be scheduling a family meeting this afternoon to discuss DNR protocols and palliative care transition." Rebecca made a sound. Not quite a word. Not quite a scream. Somewhere between the two. Ashley felt that sound like a bullet through her ribs. The 5 doctors walked back through the ICU doors at 0618 hours, and Sterling didn't even glance at the nurses who suddenly had a patient who was being managed for comfort rather than survival. That was the worst part. That was the moment when Ashley felt something crack in the vault door. Just slightly. Just enough that she had to grip the medication cart until her knuckles went white. She finished her shift notes, clocked out at 1,300 hours, and drove home through Savannah traffic with the radio off and only the sound of her breathing filling the car. The apartment was where she'd tried to disappear. A 1-bedroom on Victory Drive with no photos, no mementos, nothing that suggested she'd ever been anything other than a person who worked night shifts and occasionally ordered Thai food at midnight. The unit patch was still in the showbox under the bed. She pulled it out now, the faded embroidery of the Naval Special Warfare insignia catching the afternoon light. 2 decades of muscle memory and training and operations that had scrubbed her name off every official record, and it all came down to this, knowing how to save someone and being forced to watch them die instead. She returned to Sacred Heart at 2,000 hours for the night shift. The captain was still unconscious, his monitors showing the slow decline that came with withdrawal of aggressive treatment. The medications that had been keeping his blood pressure elevated were being tapered. The 4 fluids were being reduced. The ventilator settings were being adjusted downward in the way that was meant to be gentle, merciful, slow. Ashley moved through her assigned patients with the same methodical precision, but something had shifted. The trembling in her hands had stopped. Her posture had straightened slightly. When she approached bed 3 to perform a routine dressing change at 2,247 hours, her movements were exact, economical, carrying the weight of 17 years spent in contexts where mistakes were measured in lives rather than insurance claims. The captain's eyes flickered. Just slightly. Just enough that she registered the movement before his consciousness sank back down. But in that moment, his gaze caught on her hands, on the specific way she tied off the gauze with a combat medic's efficiency, each knot precise and doubled, the kind of tying you learned from someone who'd shown you the exact same motion 10,000 times. His eyes widened. Awareness returned for just long enough to register something. Recognition. "You served," he rasped. His voice was barely a whisper, the kind of whisper that came from a throat hooked to oxygen and pain medication in equal measure. "I've seen that technique. Only one unit does it that way. Only one." Ashley met his eyes for exactly 1 second. That was enough. That was dangerous. She finished the dressing and pulled back, her voice dropping to barely above a breath. "Rest now, sir." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. Dr. Sterling moved through the ICU doors with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. For physicians trailed behind him like satellites orbiting the sun, Dr. Mendez from cardiology with his silver cufflinks, Dr. Kim from surgery with her clipboard held like a shield, Dr. Patel from pulmonology whose shoes clicked against the tile in perfect rhythm, and Dr. Hayes from critical care whose face carried the weight of too many terminal decisions. They assembled around the captain's bed with the choreography of men who had done this ritual before, though never with Ashley watching from the monitor station, her hand stilling over the keyboard. Sterling placed his palm flat against the patient's chart. The gesture was theatrical, reverent, the kind of thing that looked good in front of families. "We've completed our comprehensive review," he announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. The captain's sister stood near the window, coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips, her eyes moving from doctor to doctor as if counting them, as if the number mattered. 5 experienced physicians have examined this case. The injuries are incompatible with survival. The internal bleeding pattern, the organ cascade failure, the trauma load, it's simply too much. We're recommending comfort care only. Withdrawal of aggressive treatment is the most humane path forward. The words fell like stones into still water. Ashley set down her pen. She didn't stand immediately. She let the moment breathe, let Sterling finish his pronouncement, let him bask in the unified nod of 4 other doctors. Then she moved. Not rushed. Not emotional. Just the simple physics of someone standing up and walking toward the bed, her badge catching the fluorescent light and throwing it back at him like a challenge. "This man can survive," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel through scar tissue. The bleeding cascade is stabilizing. His organ function is improving. His creatinine levels dropped 0.3 from this morning. He's not failing. He's recovering. Sterling's face changed. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of transformation that happens when someone realizes they've just been contradicted by someone they've already decided was beneath them. His jaw tightened. His eyes went cold. He turned to face her fully, and when he spoke, each word was a weapon carefully selected and deliberately placed. "Nurse Cooper." Her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. "Your emotional attachment to this patient is clouding your clinical judgment. This is an inappropriate boundary violation. You are grossly overstepping your scope of practice. You are a bedside nurse. You are not a physician. You do not interpret labs. You do not make prognosis calls. You do not speak about treatment decisions. That is not your role." He paused. He was good at pauses. They gave people time to feel the weight of his authority. Then he turned to the captain's sister, and his voice shifted to something almost gentle, the tone a parent uses when explaining something sad to a child. "I apologize that our colleague here has given you false hope. Some nurses watch too much television and think they are physicians. It's a common problem in modern healthcare. What matters now is that your brother is comfortable. That he doesn't suffer. That we allow nature to take its course." The sister's face collapsed like a building scheduled for demolition. Her coffee cup came down, trembling. Her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with the moment her hope was professionally executed in front of her. Ashley absorbed it all with a single measured breath. She felt the tear escape, not a sob, not a break, just the biological response of human eyes under stress. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the gesture efficient as a combat medic stripping a wound. Then she met Sterling's gaze. His eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had just crushed something beautiful and fragile. 5 doctors walking away doesn't change what's right, Ashley said. The words were calm. The words were clear. The words were the sound of someone who had already survived things that would have destroyed anyone else. Sterling held her stare for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a victor, small and satisfied and absolutely certain of his dominance. He turned back to his allied physicians. "Let's discuss the comfort care protocol in the family consultation room." We'll need to establish clear parameters about what comfort care means, no more labs, no more aggressive interventions, medications focused purely on dignity and ease. The 5 doctors moved toward the conference room like a unified front, and that was when Ashley understood that this wasn't over. This was just beginning. 20 minutes later, Sterling walked into the main hallway where the public posting board displayed shift assignments and policy updates. He pinned a new document there with the kind of deliberate care someone uses when they're creating a monument. The form was printed on official letterhead. The words were printed in 12-point font. The whole unit could read it without getting close. A. Cooper, insubordination and scope of practice concerns, probationary status pending formal review. Nurses gathered around it like moths around a heat lamp. Ashley saw it from the medication station where she was preparing the captain's evening medications. She didn't look away. She didn't pretend not to notice. She just noted the way Brenda's eyes went wide, the way Marcus suddenly found something extremely important to do in the opposite direction, the way the hallway developed the peculiar quiet that comes right before everything changes. The break room smelled like industrial coffee and the ghost of 1,000 anxious lunches. Ashley sat at the corner table with her sandwich on a paper plate, turkey, mustard, a bag of pretzels she'd grabbed from the vending machine. She was halfway through the first bite when Chen and Rodriguez and Williamson walked in. They'd been friendly yesterday. They'd shared stories during the night shift. They'd asked her about her training, about her methods, about the way she moved with such quiet competence through her tasks. Chen saw her and stopped mid-stride. Her eyes darted to the sandwich, to Ashley's face, to the empty chairs around her. "Oh, I just remembered I need to," Chen started, already moving toward the exit. Rodriguez grabbed her own lunch, a container of leftover pad thai that smelled complex and alive, and followed without looking back. Williamson's coffee cup was half full, but she took a long sip, set it down with elaborate care, and left it there cooling on the counter as she disappeared through the doorway. In 15 seconds, the break room was Ashley and a sandwich. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away from the table. She took another bite of her turkey sandwich with hands that were steady as surgical lights. Her eyes focused on the small rip in the linoleum where someone had caught their shoe 6 months ago. The sensation was familiar, the isolation, the sudden reversion from colleague to pariah, the way professional relationships could flip like a light switch when one person with authority decided you were expendable. It was pain, but pain was information. Pain was data. Pain meant something was true. At 2:02 that afternoon, Sterling's email arrived in the inboxes of 47 people, the entire department. The subject line read, "Urgent, staff probation notice." Ashley watched it populate in real time, saw the little notification badge appear on her hospital computer, saw the moment when her name became something discussed rather than something spoken to. The email was a masterpiece of institutional language. It listed her violations with the precision of someone who had written these documents before: unilateral clinical recommendations, boundary violations with patient family members, insubordination toward attending physicians, scope of practice overreach, potential liability exposure, institutional reputation concerns. Each charge was supported by a detail so small it was almost true, twisted just enough to become something darker. The closing line was Sterling's signature move: "We cannot allow Florence Nightingale fantasies to compromise evidence-based medicine." Probation period, 30 days pending formal review. CC to everyone. No way to unsee it. No way to unread it. No way to not know that every person on that email list had just been told that Ashley Cooper was a problem. She closed the email. She continued her shift. She changed the captains for fluids at 3:15. She adjusted his sedation at 4:33. She checked his oxygen saturation at 5:30 and noted the reading in the chart, 94% on 6 liters. Stable. Improving. The kind of vital signs that belonged on a patient who was recovering, not a patient who was dying. During the evening round, Sterling came by the bed with Dr. Patel. He didn't acknowledge Ashley except to tilt his head toward the patient with the kind of gesture that said she should leave. She left. She stood in the hallway and listened to him explain to Dr. Patel that this case was becoming problematic because of staff interference. He said it loud enough for her to hear. He said it like he was performing for an audience only she could see. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Sterling did when he walked into the hospital CEO's office that evening with a leather folder under his arm and a story ready to tell. The worst part was the private meeting with 3 board members, the ones whose names appeared on plaques in the main lobby, the ones whose donations had funded the new surgical wing. The worst part was Sterling placing his hands flat on the mahogany conference table and saying, very quietly, "I'm concerned about Nurse Cooper's credentials. Something doesn't add up. I think we need an audit." The worst part was that the CEO, who owed Sterling for a campaign contribution he'd personally facilitated, who had appointed him to the medical staff committee, who had already decided that an attending physician was more valuable than a floor nurse, nodded and reached for the phone to call an outside investigator. The worst part was that Ashley didn't know any of this was happening. She was still 6 hours away from learning that the walls were closing in, that her second life in Savannah was already collapsing, that 5 doctors had decided her fate in a room where her voice could never reach. She finished her shift at 11 p.m. She clocked out. She walked to her car through the rain that hammered down like applause for something that hadn't happened yet. The rain followed her home. Not literally, the storm broke somewhere over the Savannah River, but in her mind, each droplet carried the weight of Sterling's signature on that probation letter, each gust of wind the collective silence of nurses who'd suddenly found reasons to reorganize supply carts when she approached. She sat in her apartment at 2 in the morning, staring at the probation notice, the words blurring and sharpening in turn. Insubordination. Scope of practice concerns. Emotional attachment compromising clinical judgment. The language was perfect. Weaponized. There was nothing in that document a hospital board couldn't defend in court, nothing that couldn't survive regulatory review. Sterling hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a masterpiece. The next morning, Ashley clocked in for her shift like nothing had changed. The difference was surgical. She was now flagged in the system, no independent orders, no direct patient advocacy without attending physician sign-off, no decisions that couldn't be documented as following someone else's instruction. It was a cage made of policy, and the bars were invisible to anyone who wasn't living inside them. The captain was still in the ICU, still on the withdrawal of treatment protocol, but Ashley's access to him was now mediated through a filter of restrictions that turned her into something less than a nurse. A monitor. An observer. A witness to someone dying while she held the tools to save him. Sterling made a point of rounds at 0800 hours precisely. He moved through the ICU with the casual authority of a man who'd already won, his white coat trailing behind him like the train of a coronation robe. 2 residents trailed in his wake, and Ashley watched from the medication station as he stopped at the captain's bedside. The patient was unconscious, his breathing shallow and mechanical, his color the gray-white of someone whose blood wasn't carrying enough oxygen. Sterling reviewed the chart with theatrical slowness, pointing at vital signs, nodding to himself like he was confirming something he'd already known. Then he turned, made eye contact with Ashley across the ICU, and held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking away. The message was clear. "I see you. I know what you want to do. I've made sure you can't." By day 3, the restrictions had metastasized into something systematic. Ashley was assigned to intake and discharge paperwork, crucial work, necessary work, but work that kept her 3 floors away from the captain. When she requested reassignment back to critical care, the charge nurse pulled her into the hallway with an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dr. Sterling's recommendation," the charge nurse said. "He's concerned about continuity issues. Thinks it's best if the captain stays with the core critical care team while everything gets sorted." It wasn't a lie. It was worse than a lie. It was the kind of institutional maneuver that couldn't be challenged without looking like you were trying to circumvent proper procedure. Ashley nodded, thanked her, and returned to her desk where a stack of discharge summaries waited, each one a small surrender. The thing about being caged by policy is that no one can accuse you of being in a cage. Sterling had turned the entire hospital into his instrument. When the attending physician on the captain's case, a cardiologist named Dr. Hayes, rounded in the afternoons, Sterling would materialize beside him like a shadow with a stethoscope. "Patient's organs are failing," Sterling would say, his voice carrying across the ICU, not loud, but pitched so that nurses and residents could hear it clearly. "The withdrawal protocol is the kindest path forward. We need to prepare the family." Dr. Hayes, who'd inherited the case when Sterling orchestrated the rotation, would nod, and between them they reinforced the narrative that had already been established. One captain, 5 doctors, a withdrawal of treatment order that had become institutional consensus. But something was shifting in the captain's room that nobody seemed to notice. Ashley passed it each morning on her way to medical records, a brief glimpse through the window before she forced her gaze away. His color was changing. Not the grey-white of hemorrhagic shock anymore, but something closer to normal. His respirations were deeper, less labored. The numbers on his monitor, oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure, they were all trending upward, slowly but unmistakably. It made no sense. Doctors didn't withdraw treatment and then watch patients improve. That wasn't how sepsis worked. That wasn't how catastrophic internal bleeding worked. Ashley had seen enough casualties in field hospitals to know what a dying body looked like, and the captain's body was doing something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Sterling noticed it too. On day 5, during morning rounds, his jaw clenched as he reviewed the captain's labs. The young resident presenting the case, a bright kid named Morrison, fresh from his second year, stammered through the numbers. Temperatures down to 101.8. White cell count dropping. Creatinine stable. Actually, kidney function is improving. Sterling snatched the chart from Morrison's hands with a movement that was almost violent. "When was the last transfusion?" he demanded. "Who ordered blood work this morning? And who," his voice dropped to something cold and pointed, "has been adjusting before fluids?" Morrison looked terrified. The other residents exchanged glances. "We've been following the protocol," Morrison managed. "Minimal interventions only." That was when Sterling's eyes found Ashley across the ICU. She was standing at the medication station, filling a patient's insulin syringe with the kind of mechanical precision that took zero concentration, which meant her attention was perfectly available for Sterling to feel it landing on him like an accusation. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just held her gaze with an expression that cycled through confusion and then understanding and then something darker, a man realizing his cage might have holes in it. She met his stare with the kind of composure that came from doing this work in places where showing fear meant your patients' families didn't trust you. Then she looked back down at the syringe in her hand and continued drawing up medication for a patient whose name Sterling probably didn't know. The captain regained consciousness on day 6 at 2,247 hours. Ashley wasn't supposed to be in his room. She was supposed to be charting on the 3rd floor, catching up on the paperwork that Sterling had reassigned her to as a kind of professional purgatory. But Mrs. Chen in room 12 had hit her call button for water at 22:41, and Ashley had gone to get it, and on her way back to the elevator she'd glanced through the window of the captain's room out of habit, out of the muscle memory of caring for someone whose injuries she understood in ways the hospital would never put in her file. His eyes were open. That was the first thing. After 6 days of the grey unconsciousness of critical illness, the captain's eyes were present, tracking, focused. He was watching the monitor. He was watching before pump. He was aware. And when Ashley stepped inside the room, just for a moment, just to check his vital signs, because that was still technically her job even if Sterling had tried to make it impossible, his eyes found her with the kind of intensity that belonged to someone who'd been looking for her. She moved with the routine efficiency of someone checking monitors, hands moving to assess 4 sites, to verify the numbers on the screen against what her trained eye could see. The captain's respiration was deep and steady. His color was genuinely normal now, the pink of tissue getting adequate oxygen, the flush of a body that was healing despite the orders to stop trying. She was reaching to adjust the dressing on his central line when his hand moved. Not the jerky, involuntary movement of someone emerging from unconsciousness, but a deliberate action, fingers reaching toward her wrist with the kind of control that meant he was more present than he'd been in days. "Your hands," he rasped. His voice was rough from the breathing tube, the words barely above a whisper. "How you're tying that gauze? The way the specific technique." His eyes tracked her movements with the kind of focus that made her movements suddenly conscious. "Combat medic. 2nd Battalion Special Operations. Helmand Province. That's the way, only one unit does it that way." He paused, his breathing labored now with the effort of speaking. "Did you serve? Are you?" His eyes searched her face with a kind of desperate understanding. "You're too good at this. At keeping people alive. You're not just a nurse." The room seemed to contract. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator that wasn't being used anymore sat silent in the corner like a monument to the doctors who decided he was going to die. Ashley's hands stilled. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest, feel the way her body wanted to respond, to acknowledge what he'd recognized, to confirm the thing she'd spent months burying under scrubs and deferential nods and the kind of careful professionalism that made her invisible. But the door to the ICU was visible through the window in his room. And Dr. Sterling had a habit of appearing at precisely the moment when something important was about to be said. So instead, Ashley finished the gauze tie with the same efficient precision that had given her away, straightened the captain's blanket, and met his eyes with a look that was almost acknowledgement. "You need your rest," she said quietly. "Your oxygen saturation's still climbing. That's a good sign." She turned to leave, and behind her she heard him exhale something that might have been relief or recognition or the sound of someone who'd just realized that the person he thought he needed saving by had been there all along. She was halfway to the elevator when Sterling materialized from the stairwell with the timing of someone who'd been waiting. He was alone, his coat buttoned, his badge catching the fluorescent light as he moved toward her with the casual authority of a predator that hasn't yet needed to run. "Patient's regaining consciousness," he said. Not a question. A statement. Accusation dressed up as observation. That's unexpected. Given the withdrawal protocol. Given the... He paused, letting the implication hang in the air between them like a challenge, restricted interventions you've been maintaining under your current probationary status. Ashley continued walking toward the elevator. The hallway was empty at this hour except for the sound of machines humming behind closed doors, the distant beeping of monitors, the breathing sounds of people fighting to stay alive. Sterling kept pace with her, his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounded almost predatory. "I haven't done anything beyond my scope," Ashley said, and her voice was steady in a way that made Sterling's expression darken. She didn't sound defensive. She didn't sound concerned. She sounded like someone stating a fact. "I followed the withdrawal protocol exactly as written. Minimum interventions. Basic comfort care. That's all. His vital signs are improving," Sterling said. "His organ function is improving. His blood work is improving. None of that happens on its own, Ms. Cooper. None of that happens when a patient's been written off. Unless someone is intervening. Unless someone is providing care that's above their authorized scope." His voice had taken on the texture of someone trying to solve a puzzle, and the puzzle was her. "So I'm going to ask you directly. What exactly have you been doing in that patient's room?" The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors opened. Ashley stepped inside and turned to face him. For just a moment, long enough for Sterling to recognize what he was seeing, her expression shifted from professional deference to something else. Not anger. Not fear. Something colder. Something that looked like the calm that comes when you've already survived the worst thing that can happen to you and lived to tell about it. "The same thing you taught me," Ashley said quietly. "To keep people alive. That's what nurses do." The doors closed before Sterling could respond, and as the elevator descended, Ashley pressed her forehead against the cool metal and breathed. She had 4 hours left on her shift. For hours before the night deepened into that dark stretch between midnight and sunrise when hospitals became their own separate world, when the visiting hours ended and the families went home and the only people left were the ones whose job it was to guard the thin line between living and dying. For hours before the captain's breathing would change. For hours before everything would break open. The clock above the captain's bed read 0247 when Ashley noticed his breathing had changed. Not dramatically. Not the kind of change that would trip alarms or draw attention from the skeleton crew working the night shift at Sacred Heart. But Ashley had spent 12 years reading bodies the way other people read books, and what she saw in the rise and fall of his chest made her move without thinking. The breathing was rapid now. Shallow. Asymmetric, the left side rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't match the right. His oxygen saturation had begun its slow drift downward. 91, 89. 87, not emergency numbers. Not yet. But the trajectory was wrong. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pushing against the heart. She'd seen it twice in Helmand Province, both times in combat situations where a chest wound had sealed over, trapping pressure inside. Both times, the window between recognition and cardiac collapse was brutally narrow. 7 minutes. Maybe 8. She didn't call for a resident. Didn't page Sterling. Didn't follow the chain of command that had been deliberately constructed to keep her away from this patient's care. The protocols that said she should notify a physician, that she should wait, that she should defer to the 5 doctors who'd already decided this man's organs weren't worth saving. Instead, her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory was a physical thing, not emotion, not instinct, something deeper. It was neural pathways carved by 10,000 repetitions in austere environments where mistakes meant body bags. She grabbed the crash cart. Found the 14-gauge needle. Her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in darkness, in dust storms, with mortar fire rattling windows that didn't exist. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She palpated the ribs, finding the landmarks on the captain's chest, her touch efficient and certain. 1 breath. Then her hands positioned the needle at the precise angle, not straight down, slightly posterior to miss the vessels running along the rib's inferior edge, and she drove it between his ribs. The hiss came instantly. Air escaping under pressure. The sound of a tire deflating in fast forward. His oxygen saturation stopped falling. 87, then it climbed. 89, 91. 94, his breathing normalized within seconds, the asymmetry vanishing as both lungs inflated equally, the pressure released, the heart free to beat without obstruction. She'd done it without touching a physician's order. Without authorization. Without the documentation that hospital protocols required. Without permission from the system designed to prevent exactly this kind of action. By 02:53, the captain's vital signs had stabilized completely. His color improved. His heart rate dropped from the tachycardic sprint of compensation to something reasonable. 82 beats per minute. Normal. Stable. Alive. And by 02:58, Dr. Sterling walked into the ICU. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the space he occupied. His eyes found Ashley standing beside the captain's bed, her hand still steady, her expression neutral. She didn't flinch. Didn't explain. Didn't apologize. Just met his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Sterling's jaw tightened. He pulled the captain's chart. His eye scanned the vital signs, the oxygen saturation numbers, the note Ashley had written, recognized signs of pneumothorax, needle decompression performed at second intercostal space midclavicular line, patient stabilized, O2 sat 94% and holding, respiratory rate normalized. For 3 seconds, he didn't move. His face went a color that Ashley recognized, the red of a man watching his carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. "You didn't call a physician," he said. Not a question. Patient was in crisis. Intervention was time-sensitive. You performed an invasive procedure without an order. You violated scope of practice. You directly contradicted the treatment plan established by 5 attending physicians. Ashley didn't respond. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Sterling's hand trembled slightly as he set down the chart. Not from fear. From something worse. From rage that had nowhere to go. The captain was stable. The intervention had been medically correct. The procedure had saved a life that 5 doctors had already written off. And she had done it anyway. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting," he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and quiet. "This ends today." By 0600, the wheels were already turning. Sterling's network activated like a machine designed precisely for situations like this. He sat in his office with coffee that had gone cold, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. One call to Mercy General's chief of surgery, a poker buddy, someone who owed him a favor from a malpractice case that had gone away quietly. Another call to the medical director at St. Mary's, his brother-in-law, which was essentially the same thing. The CEO of Sacred Heart, already in the office at an hour most humans should be sleeping, listening to Sterling's carefully constructed presentation of the facts, unauthorized procedure, direct violation of protocol, scope of practice violation, potential liability exposure. And then Sterling made the call that changed everything. "I need to verify someone's licensing status," he said to whoever answered at the nursing school number listed on Ashley's employment application. His voice carried the authority of a physician investigating a credential. "Ashley Cooper. Graduated 2016? Thank you. No, I'll hold." The pause lasted 40 seconds. Sterling's fingers drummed the desk. His smile was the kind that a predator wore when it sensed blood in the water. "I see," he said. "You have no record of that name. Thank you." He hung up without saying goodbye. He made 2 more calls. To the state licensing board. To a private investigator he'd used before, a woman named Morrison who specialized in credential verification and had connections that ran deep into databases that weren't technically public. By 0700, Morrison was pulling strings. By 0730, Sterling had his answer. Ashley Cooper had no nursing school records. No graduation records. No transcript. No evidence of ever having attended the institution she'd listed on her employment application. It was clean work. Whoever had created her civilian identity had been thorough: social security number, driver's license, nursing license, all legitimate and traceable to legitimate institutions. But the nursing school was a thin place in the facade. 1 phone call and it shattered. Sterling brought the evidence to the CEO at 0815. He laid out the documentation with the precision of a surgeon closing a wound. No nursing school record. No graduation certificate. Falsified employment records. And the procedure she performed without authorization, an invasive medical intervention that a licensed nurse practitioner could perform only under physician supervision, which she clearly did not have. She put this hospital at serious risk, Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of righteousness. Liability, regulatory violation, and we have no idea if her nursing license is even legitimate. The CEO's hand moved toward the phone before Sterling finished speaking. By 0930, the outside investigator Sterling had hired was conducting interviews. By 1000, security had already been notified. By 10:45, Ashley was being called to a meeting in the administrative wing, not the conference room where they discussed her probationary status, but the HR office, the room where terminations happened. She knew what was coming before she walked through the door. The way the CEO wouldn't meet her eyes. The termination letter printed and signed, sitting on the desk like a knife. The security officer standing in the hallway, waiting to escort her from the building. She'd been terminated before, never for something fabricated, but she knew the architecture of institutional dismissal. The careful documentation. The attempt to make it seem orderly, procedural, immune to appeal. Your employment with Sacred Heart is terminated effective immediately, the CEO said, his voice careful and measured. The letter outlines the reasons. Falsified employment records and unauthorized performance of medical procedures constitute grounds for immediate dismissal. Ashley held the letter. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. I understand. Security will escort you from the premises. Your badge will be deactivated. We've instructed you not to return to the hospital or contact current staff. Do you have any questions? No, Ashley said. She packed her locker in silence. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a joke gift from a nurse 3 years ago who'd worked in her unit before moving to Tampa. A dying succulent she'd been trying to keep alive on the windowsill for 6 months, its leaves brown and papery. A photograph in a frame, the only thing she carried from her real life, her SEAL team before the 2019 operation, all of them smiling at the camera in their dress blues, faces she would never see again. She put them in a cardboard box. The security guard, a kid named Marcus who'd always been kind, who'd smiled at her in the break room, wouldn't meet her eyes as he walked her toward the exit. The December rain started as she reached the bus stop outside Sacred Heart's main entrance. Cold rain. The kind that soaks through scrubs, that turns the parking lot into dark reflective glass. She stood at the bench, the cardboard box in her arms, and watched her breath fog in the air. 3 times. She'd rebuilt her life 3 times. 3 times she'd constructed a civilian identity, found honest work, tried to be the person she'd been told to pretend to be. 3 times it had dissolved. But this time felt different. This time she wasn't being extracted. She wasn't being relocated. She was just standing in the rain with a box of belongings and no idea where the next version of herself would come from. The bus pulled up. The doors opened. She could get on, ride downtown, find a shelter, figure out the next step. She could disappear deeper, become someone else, do this dance again. Instead, she stood at the curb and didn't move. The bus driver waited 3 seconds, then closed the doors and pulled away, leaving her alone in the rain. The rain kept falling. Ashley stood at the bus stop on Victory Drive, water dripping from her hair onto the cardboard box she held against her chest like a shield. Inside it, a cracked ceramic mug from some long-ago base exchange, a succulent with brown-edged leaves that she'd tried to keep alive for 3 months, and a photograph. The photo showed 11 people in desert camouflage, standing in front of a canvas tent in Helmand Province. Their faces were turned toward the sun. Nobody was smiling. The operators never smiled for cameras. She was third from the left, younger then, with scars she hadn't collected yet. The bus had come and gone. She'd watched it disappear around the corner with the deliberation of someone deciding whether to step off a cliff. At 0600 that morning, Dr. Sterling had received a phone call from his investigator. The nursing school Ashley listed on her employment application, Savannah State College of Nursing, graduated 2016, had no record of anyone named Ashley Cooper in their system. Ever. Not 2016. Not 2015. Not before, not after. When he pushed harder, the investigator found something worse. The references provided by the school didn't match. The contact numbers she'd given were disconnected. The faculty names didn't exist in any public directory. The digital signatures on her credentials bore inconsistencies in the metadata, dates that didn't align, timestamps that contradicted, encryption protocols that predated the supposed certification year. By 0745, Sterling had walked directly to the CEO's office with the file in hand. By 0900, hospital security had been called. By 10:45, Ashley was standing in the rain with a cardboard box. The security guard who'd escorted her out had been apologetic, his jaw tight with discomfort. "I'm sorry, Ms. Cooper. I'm just following orders." Those were the last words anyone at Sacred Heart had said to her. Following orders. The same phrase that had built empires and destroyed them, that had defined her entire adult life until she'd tried to stop. The termination letter had been surgical in its precision. Falsified employment records. Unauthorized medical procedures. Scope of practice violations. The violation of performing a needle decompression between the second and third ribs at 0247 hours, an action that had saved the captain's life but violated the hospital's governance policies, which stated that only licensed physicians could perform emergency chest decompression. The letter didn't mention that she'd saved a man the 5 doctors had abandoned. It only mentioned the rules she'd broken. She didn't fight the termination. She didn't demand a hearing or legal representation. She didn't call the number that was still active in her phone, the classified Pentagon line that could have made everything stop with one sentence: "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Naval Special Warfare Command." That call would have triggered a cascade of federal involvement that would have revealed classified operations, scrubbed records, and the 2019 mission that officially never happened. The orders to disappear had been explicit. Vanish. Establish a civilian identity. Never surface. Never acknowledge the operation. Never speak the names of the team members who hadn't come home. Fighting meant losing the veil. And the veil was all she had left. The rain turned colder as afternoon arrived, that particular Savannah dampness that seeped into your bones and wouldn't leave. Ashley's scrubs were still on under her jacket. She'd changed into civilian clothes before security walked her out, a small mercy from the guard who'd looked away as she'd done it. The badge was gone. The hospital ID. The parking pass. Everything that had said she belonged somewhere. She'd taken the first bus that arrived, which happened to be heading away from the hospital, and got off at a stop she didn't recognize. There was a laundromat across the street, a closed pharmacy, a check-cashing place with bars on the windows. The neighborhood had the particular exhaustion of places where people worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford rent. She understood that exhaustion. She lived in it now. By 1200 hours the next day, the Black Hawk landed in Sacred Heart's parking lot like a judgment from God. The rotor wash shook the windows hard enough that nurses in the maternity ward looked up from their stations. The pilot held position for exactly 90 seconds, then cut the engines. 2 officers descended the aluminum stairs in dress uniforms so pressed they looked like they'd been cut from steel. Their boots hit the asphalt in perfect sync. One was a Navy commander with silver eagles on his shoulders. The other was a Master Chief Petty Officer with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years making hard decisions in harder places. They didn't go to the emergency department. They went directly upstairs to the administrative wing. Dr. Sterling was in the CEO's office, reviewing his metrics for the month. He'd been in an excellent mood all morning. The troublesome nurse was gone. The captain was stable, true, but he was stable despite Ashley's unauthorized intervention, not because of it. The antibiotics were doing their job. Time and proper protocol were doing their job. The system was correct, as it always was. Sterling had even drafted a memo about reviewing nursing credentials hospital-wide, a memo that would subtly establish him as the guardian of institutional integrity. By next month, he'd be recommending himself for a promotion to Chief of Medicine. The door to the CEO's office opened without a knock. The 2 naval officers stood in the doorway like sentries at a gate. The commander's eyes found Sterling and didn't look away. Dr. Marcus Sterling. Yes? Sterling felt something shift in the room's pressure, the way the air changes before a lightning strike. I'm Commander James Halsey, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This is Master Chief Cole Whitney, Naval Special Warfare Command. We need to discuss your recent investigation into the credentials of one Ashley Marie Cooper. Sterling's stomach performed a slow rotation. I don't know who that is. That nurse was a fraud. I was protecting, you were committing federal crimes, Halsey interrupted. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind of voice that came from 20 years of interrogation rooms and courtroom testimony. When you contacted Savannah State College of Nursing to verify Ms. Cooper's credentials, you triggered an alert in a protected federal database. When you hired a private investigator to dig into her background, that investigator unknowingly accessed systems monitored by NCIS. Every phone call you made. Every record you tried to access. Every email you sent requesting information about her employment history. We have documentation of all of it. Sterling felt his face drain of blood. I was just checking credentials. That's standard procedure. Standard procedure, Whitney repeated, and his voice sounded like a match striking in an empty room, doesn't include attempting to alter federal maritime employment records. You contacted a number your investigator pulled from a public directory for Savannah State College of Nursing. That number is actually a naval intelligence monitoring system. Your calls were recorded. Your investigator's data requests were logged. The CEO rose from behind his desk, backing away from Sterling like he'd suddenly become contagious. Sterling's mind was racing, trying to find the exit, the explanation, the way out. I had no knowledge of that. The investigator acted independently. I was simply attempting to destroy the career of a military service member, Halsey finished. A service member who was following direct orders from JSOC task force leadership. Orders to establish a civilian identity. Orders not to acknowledge her military service. Orders to disappear from official records. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the ventilation system humming through the building's bones. Whitney stepped forward. When he moved, it was with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades in places where hesitation meant death. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper served 14 years in naval special warfare. She completed 13 deployments, 3 of them to Helmand Province. In 2019, she was part of a classified operation. The specific details remain sealed and above your clearance level, but what you need to know is this: she performed combat medical actions that saved 43 lives. Not figuratively. Literally 43 people who would be dead if not for her decisions under fire. Sterling opened his mouth. No sound emerged. After that operation was officially terminated and all personnel were reassigned, Senior Chief Cooper was given direct orders by JSOC to establish a civilian identity and cease all contact with military personnel. She complied. She became a nurse. She followed the rules. And then she came to work at your hospital, where an Army Ranger captain was brought in with injuries sustained in the same conflict zone she'd served in. When you and 4 other physicians decided to stop treatment, she made the decision to intervene. Not because of emotional attachment. Not because of inappropriate boundaries. But because she recognized a patient she could save, and she saved him. The CEO moved further away from Sterling, now standing by the window, watching something in the distance. Sterling was alone in the center of the room now, with 2 naval officers and the certain knowledge that his career was ending. At 02 for 7 hours, Halsey continued. Senior Chief Cooper performed a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, for a tension pneumothorax that you and your team had failed to recognize. The procedure is documented in the patient's medical record as performed by an unidentified staff member. But the technique used, the specific way she secured the needle, the angle of entry, the timing, these things have a signature. And when we ran the captain's medical data through military personnel database, we found that Senior Chief Cooper was trained in this exact technique by the same combat medical school that trains naval special warfare operators. Sterling's hands were shaking now. Real shaking. Not controlled. Not measured. The kind of shaking that came from understanding, all at once, that you'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Your attempts to investigate her credentials, your calls to falsified contact numbers, your private investigator's search, these actions constitute tampering with a protected federal witness in classified military status. You've committed federal crimes, Dr. Sterling. Obstruction of justice. Unauthorized access to federal databases. Conspiracy to interfere with military personnel. The FBI agents arrived through the door behind them, moving with the same synchronized precision as the naval officers. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what they were. "You're under arrest," Halsey said, and the agents moved forward with handcuffs that clicked open with a soft, metallic sound like a gun's safety being released. The rights were read in the hallway. The same hallway where Sterling had posted Ashley's write-up on the public board, where he'd gathered 5 other physicians to announce that the captain's care would be withdrawn, where he'd told Ashley in front of the patient's sister that her emotional attachment was a liability. As he was led past the ICU, the captain was visible through the isolation window. He was sitting up in bed now, color returning to his face, vital signs stable, the trajectory that Ashley's intervention had made possible. The nurses who'd shunned her in the break room stood in the hallway watching Sterling's perp walk, their expressions carrying the slow, terrible realization that they'd witnessed something sacred and had chosen the side of fear. His white coat was removed by security before he reached the elevators. His hospital credentials were cut from his neck. His ID badge was scanned one final time as he exited the building, not as an employee, but as someone leaving a federal custody situation. 6 months later, someone spotted him at a strip mall on Route 17, sitting at a folding table outside a tax preparation kiosk. He was selling life insurance now, cold calling strangers about term policies, his medical license revoked, his surgical privileges terminated, his donor network evaporated like morning fog. The cardiograph in his chest beat on, the same organ that had been sure enough in its arrogance to second-guess a combat medic's instinct. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The captain's daughter had spent 3 months researching her father's recovery, tracing the medical interventions that had kept him alive. She'd found the gap in the official paperwork at 02 for 7 hours. She'd talked to nurses. She'd reviewed the patient records with a historian's meticulous care. And when she found the faded unit patch, the one sewn inside her father's jacket lining, the one that bore the insignia of naval special warfare, she'd made a decision. She tracked down Ashley through military channels, through connections her father finally remembered, through the kind of determination that comes from knowing you're looking for someone who saved your father's life twice. Once in a hospital ICU. Once in a field hospital in Helmand Province when his unit was overrun and the medic, the same medic who'd tied off his gauze with that specific combat efficiency, had held his hand while his team fought for the exit. The captain remembered her now. The name came back first. Then the face. Then the feeling of standing in fire with his intestines wrapped and his blood pressure barely registering, listening to her voice, "You're not dying today, Captain. Not today." By month 6, Sacred Heart's new chief of medicine, promoted after Sterling's arrest and the subsequent investigation into his conduct, had made a personal request to Ashley. Not to return as a nurse. To return as Director of Emergency Medicine with full physician privileges, her military medical credentials finally recognized by federal order, her classification from JSOC revised to allow her to acknowledge her rank and service in civilian medical settings. And Ashley had said yes. The Black Hawk landed on Sacred Heart's helipad at 1,400 hours on a Thursday, bringing a wounded soldier from a training accident at Fort Stewart. Ashley stood on that helipad in her Navy dress uniform, the service dress blues that hung like they'd been tailored for her body specifically. The Navy Cross was visible on her chest, hanging from its ribbon like a weight made of light. Below it, 2 silver stars. Below those, the purple hearts that represented the 2 times her own body had paid the price for the decision to save everyone else. The captain stood beside her in a wheelchair, his recovery remarkable but incomplete. He would walk again, the physical therapists promised, but his left side would never have full strength. His sister stood on his other side, and she was crying without trying to hide it. "You taught me something I needed to learn," the captain said, his voice still rough from the ventilator work. "You taught me that orders aren't always right. That sometimes the right thing costs everything." Ashley didn't respond verbally. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and the gesture held everything, every moment in the ICU, every rule she'd broken, every sacrifice she'd made to remain hidden until the moment she was needed most. The helicopter descended. The rotors cut the Georgia sky like a knife. The wounded soldier was brought out on a stretcher, and Ashley pulled on fresh gloves, the same hands that had performed that needle decompression, the same hands that had learned their trade in places that didn't appear on maps. She ran toward the patient, and her team followed, Jessica and 2 other nurses who'd shunned her in the break room, who understood now what they'd witnessed when they'd chosen fear instead of faith. They moved with her in formation, not behind her but alongside, which was a kind of apology and a kind of redemption all at once. In the distance, a figure watched from the parking lot. A man with a cracked windshield in a 12-year-old sedan. Dr. Sterling had driven past on his insurance route, taking a break, watching the woman he'd tried to destroy now saving lives in full uniform. He watched until the doors of the emergency department closed, then he drove away without being seen, and Ashley never knew he was there, and wouldn't have cared if she did. Because she was doing what she'd been trained to do. What she'd never stop doing. What no administrator or protocol or 5 doctors with terminal certainty could prevent. She was saving the ones who mattered most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, Please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the heroes we walk past every day. Comment below, what would you have done in Ashley's position? And share this with someone who needs to know they're stronger than their circumstances. Thank you for watching.